Italy, 1944. The Allies fight to wrest control of Italy from the Germans, while the Germans turn every ridge and mountain into a fortress.
The Germans always had a hill higher than us. They could see us coming.
Battle-hardened German troops set traps and wait for the Allied tanks to roll into them.
We would let them come close. Then, when they got very close, we would fire.
Canadian troops fight the Germans across rivers, through valleys, and up mountain ridges.
They had Italy, and they were doing their best not to give it up, and we were doing our best to get them out of it. It would be tank versus tank.
Canadian and German armor clash in the battle for Italy. Italy today, beautiful, peaceful. But for thousands of years, armies fought here. The Carthaginian general Hannibal, Attila the Hun, and Napoleon Bonaparte all struggled here to win supremacy over the Mediterranean Sea.
Italy is that great land bridge that connects three continents together. So all of the great empires that exist around the rim of the Mediterranean Sea have sought to control the Italian peninsula.
And never was the fighting more vicious or desperate than between the Allies and the Germans in the Second World War. On July 10th, 1943, thousands of Canadian troops storm ashore near Pechino on the southeast coast of the island of Sicily as part of the Allied invasion force. In a mere 6 weeks, the Allies conquer Sicily. And on the 3rd of September, they launch the invasion of the Italian mainland. 5 days later, on September 8th, 1943, Italy surrenders.
The collapse of the fascist government in Italy led to the removal of the Italian armed forces from the Second World War, forcing the Germans to backfill with their own naval forces, air forces, and ground forces to defend the south coast of Europe.
In a dramatic turnaround, Italy's former ally, Nazi Germany, decides to fight for every inch of Italian soil.
They didn't just send 60 divisions to the south coast of Europe, they sent 60 of the best divisions to stop the Allies from breaking through into the southern approaches to Germany itself.
And these well-trained, well-equipped German troops quickly discover they have a crucial and formidable new ally: the Italian landscape. Running right down the spine of the Italian boot is a central mountain range, the Apennines. Spurs of the Apennines reach out to both east and west coasts, creating a 1,000-kilometer obstacle course of narrow coastal valleys, steep ridges, and an endless series of streams and rivers.
And there were rivers everywhere, a nuisance. Every 3 miles we had another river to get over. A river every 3 miles is the worst possible tank country. But what difference does it make? That's what we were, that's what we had to do.
Exploiting every twist in the terrain, the Germans build one defensive line after another, turning over 1,000 kilometers of mountain, river, crag, and swamp into an unending battlefield.
The Germans have every advantage of terrain. There are very few avenues to advance northward in Italy. It takes a relatively small number of Germans to block all of the paths successfully.
They're in a stationary position, they're just waiting for you to come along.
The Canadians fight desperately for almost a year, including the vicious street battles in Ortona. Combat in Italy has already cost the Canadians almost 10,000 casualties. In May 1944, the Canadians finally smashed through the Gustav and Adolf Hitler lines in the Liri Valley, just 130 kilometers south of the Italian capital, Rome.
We were getting ready, quite literally, to take Rome. That was our end objective.
One of the last obstacles in the advance to Rome is the Melfa River, which cuts across the Liri Valley, 15 kilometers beyond the smashed Adolf Hitler line.
The Melfa River is a giant anti-tank ditch that bars the approaches to Rome by cutting across the Liri Valley at right angles.
The Canadians are ordered to seize the river crossings and open the road to the Eternal City. For the assault on the Melfa, the Canadian 5th Armored Division mobilizes a striking force of over 4,000 combat troops, 24 light tanks, and more than 160 Sherman medium tanks. The Sherman is the backbone of the Canadian attack. The Sherman 5 is armed with a low-velocity 75mm gun and has 51mm of frontal armor that is dangerously vulnerable to the powerful cannons on most of the German tanks. And if the Sherman is hit, it has a deadly weakness.
They called them the Bunsen burner, because when it went on fire, it really went on fire. Almost invariably, you'd lose all 5 men if the entire tank went on fire.
At the Melfa River, the Shermans and their crews will be put to a severe test. The German High Command is desperate to defend the Melfa. Its crossings are virtually the only escape route for the German soldiers, retreating north from the smashed Adolf Hitler line.
What we see in the Melfa River is a giant collision between the 26th Panzer Division that's rushing into the area to try to stabilize the German front and the Canadians that are trying to seize a crossing over the Melfa River before the Germans have a chance to turn it into a new defense line.
To defend the river crossings, the Germans field 1,000 combat troops and more than 30 tanks and assault guns, including a dozen Panther tanks. May 24th, 1944, the assault on the Melfa begins. The Shermans of the British Columbia Dragoons race towards the river crossings.
I was very apprehensive before we went into battle every day. I used to try and cover up by telling funny stories and everybody would laugh. You know, it's a tense moment before you go in. But once I was in action, I was too busy fighting to get to be tense. The infantry went in and fighting their way across. Then they couldn't get up the other side because of the machine guns, and there were machine gun nests everywhere. And there were tanks. They were up the cliff, and a couple of them were already down, giving the infantry a hard time. Apart from the artillery, then we were the solution. There was a 12-foot drop from the countryside down to the river. And we went down this 12-foot cliff to help them. It was a hell of a drop. And the Germans were trying their best to kill us. Shells are coming in like raindrops. Everybody's firing, the dust goes up everywhere, and it becomes a real mess. They came down their 12-foot cliffs and they met us on the beach. It would be tank versus tank.
The Canadians at the Melfa are the first in the West to do combat with a deadly Panther. The Panther weighs a formidable 45 tons and has sloped frontal armor 80 millimeters thick. Its long-barreled, high-velocity 75mm gun can easily cut through a Sherman.
We had no intimation whatsoever that they had moved Panthers down into Italy. The total shock to us. The Panthers were much slower than we were, but our shells just bounced off them. So they were real competition. They would go on fire same as we would if we hit them properly. If you were lucky enough to be able to put your shell right between the turret and the hull, where there was a hole, you could get in there. It's nice when the tank is firing at you, and they were, and you fire back and he blows up. That's a very good feeling, except that there are plenty of other tanks around. You don't sit around glorying, you're looking at the other tanks. I saw a couple of tanks go, but that was what you were there for.
At the end of the battle, virtually all the German tanks have been destroyed, and the Canadians are across the Melfa.
The German reinforcements are decisively defeated in and around the Melfa River, making it impossible to defend Rome.
By June 1st, the Canadians are almost in Rome, the Eternal City, and the grand prize of the campaign.
We were 26 miles away from Rome, and we figured we were going to be in Rome in about an hour, and we were told to stop. We found out why. The Americans wanted to take Rome, except it was no particular glory because the Germans didn't defend Rome.
Films taken by Italian anti-fascists show the evacuation of Rome. The streets were deserted as the Nazis left.
The Americans enter Rome on June 4th, but their glory and the headlines don't last long. 2 days later is D-Day, June 6th, 1944. As Allied troops land on the beaches in Normandy, and the decisive battle for France and Western Europe begins, suddenly the Italian campaign becomes a sideshow.
We had been in action for about 11 months before D-Day. So we thought it was kind of funny, these guys who were just coming into battle now, swanking about it. So we called ourselves the D-Day Dodgers. We dodged the D-Day by fighting for 11 months before it.
But even as France is invaded, the Germans redouble their desperate fight for Italy. And the Canadians are now about to face some of their bloodiest battles ever. After crossing the Melfa River and with Rome in friendly hands, Canadian and Allied forces rush northward, up the Italian peninsula, heading towards the core of Italy's industrial and agricultural power. In the vanguard of the advance are Canadian tank crews and their Sherman tanks. It will not be a walkover. The German armies are determined to defend northern Italy to the last.
North Italy is the breadbasket and industrial heartland of Italy as a whole. And that industrial heartland has been integrated fully into the German war economy. It is essential if the Germans are going to carry out their strategy for 1944 and 45 to maintain control of that industrial and agricultural heartland.
In the summer of 1944, the Germans are desperately building a defensive line in the north to protect the Po Valley, the supposedly invincible Gothic Line. But the Gothic Line is not yet complete, so the German High Command decides to delay the Allies at the so-called Trasimene Line. The line lies 160 kilometers north of Rome, and where it confronts the Canadians, it extends across an 8-kilometer gap between Lake Trasimene and Lake Chiusi. Between the two lakes, the Germans have improvised a 3-kilometer deep, zigzagging swath of dug-in strongpoints and machine gun posts.
The Germans choose the Lake Trasimene battlefield because any Allied drive that's going to reach the Po Valley has to come through those rolling foothills west of Lake Trasimene.
The rolling ridges and high ground offer the Germans ideal terrain for their cat-and-mouse delaying action.
The Germans always had a hill higher than us. They could see us coming.
June 21st, 1944. Canadian tanks of the Ontario Regiment go into action against German panzers.
He was in a sunken road, and all I could see was his turret and the gun sticking away out there. Him facing me with that gun was really no contest. It never is. If he gets a direct shot onto you, he can put a hole through you anyway. He seemed to try to want to get up out of that road, maybe get at me. The gun was up here, like at quite an angle. It was just like waving a chimney at you. It looked so darn long. He tried to get up, but he couldn't make it. If he got out of there, I was facing that gun head on. I shot 2 or 3 shots at him. I think I hit him. The only chance I had knocking him out was get him broadside. Their side armor wasn't as good as their front armor. Their front armor is very thick and well slanted. He just about disappeared about that time, and he went into some trees there. And I didn't see him from then on.
After 2 days of fighting, the tanks of the Ontario Regiment successfully smash through the German defenses and push ahead north along the shores of Lake Trasimene. 5 kilometers to the west, the tanks of the Three Rivers Regiment sit at their start line, waiting to enter the battle.
We were scheduled to start at 7 o'clock in the morning. They forgot to tell us the starting time had been changed. So we rolled out of our tank park and up the road to take position, only to find it was behind the German lines. So the Germans closed in behind us, and then they completely cut us off. As we moved forward with Major Johnson, we got a call on the radio from Captain Hunter, who said that he was being attacked from the rear. And Johnson said, "That's impossible." I said, "Well, if it's impossible, they've just knocked out 7 tanks." After Major Johnson told Hunter that he couldn't understand why he was getting hit from the rear, his tank got hit.
Now surrounded by Germans and far beyond infantry support, the Canadian tankers hunker down to prepare for a long fight.
We were being shelled, and we hit a bomb crater, and went into the bomb crater into what you call a turret down position. The land was fairly flat, and we were on a mold and could see what was going on. The crew commander, he saw the Panther. It was around 500 yards away from us. For a Panther or a Tiger tank, that was nothing. They had the long barrel on it, and they could outrange us. Well, our tank had an HE, a high explosive, in the breech. I said, "Leave it in. I'll use it as a tracer, as a marker." My job was to make sure I picked up the target and fire at it. And I was lucky enough to hit the Panther tank. We never knocked out a Panzer tank with a Sherman. You'd never do it. But we had hit the turret ring just below the turret, which prevented the tank from turning.
After immobilizing the Panther, the remaining tanks of the Three Rivers Regiment hold out against repeated counterattacks for more than 7 hours until they are relieved.
You go into those things with the idea that you're invincible, that regardless of what happens, they're not going to get you.
But the day has been a costly one.
We lost 13 of the 15 tanks that went into action that day. Our regiment never gave up an inch. We didn't back up. We held our position. And we never gave up a position once we took it.
The relatively unknown battle at Lake Trasimene actually cost regiments in 1st Canadian Armored Brigade some of their heaviest losses of the war. But 1st Canadian Armored Brigade is considered to be the most effective, best trained tank brigade of all the Allied forces in Italy. And it becomes essential to the fight for the rolling hills west of Lake Trasimene.
The Germans retreat northward toward the formidable Gothic Line, the last German bastion protecting the Po Valley and Italy's industrial heartland. In 1 week, the Canadians have vaulted through the Trasimene Line. They're now considered shock troops.
The Canadians were central to all of the major Allied assaults in the Italian campaign, and for that reason, the Germans understood wherever the Canadians popped up, that's where the point of Allied main effort would be.
Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, Smiling Albert, the German commander in Italy, is determined to know where the Canadians are headed next. If he knows where the Canadians are, Kesselring can be almost certain that that is where the Allies intend to assault the Gothic Line.
They figure where the first div is going to be, that's where the breakout's going to be. And it usually was.
August 1944. The Canadians know that their actions are being anxiously watched by the Germans, and so it is in secret that they transfer to the Adriatic front and prepare to attack the Gothic Line.
Allied commanders wanted to concentrate their best troops, their most powerful armored and artillery formations, to the weakest part of the Gothic Line, and so they transfer 1st Canadian Corps secretly across the Apennines to stage behind the Folia River to deliver the main assault on the Gothic Line.
The Canadians move from their position near Perugia, over 200 kilometers through the mountains, to their assembly point, just inland on the Adriatic coast.
The decision to move the Canadian Corps across the Apennines was a tremendous engineering and transport feat. The 5th Canadian Armored Divisional Engineers actually had to build a road for their armored vehicles that is still a well-used truck road to this day.
Almost 11,000 vehicles, including 650 tanks, rumble through the mountains. For the assault on the Gothic Line, the Canadians have 10,000 troops and over 260 Sherman tanks. And they aim to exploit to the fullest the Sherman's greatest strength.
The biggest thing was our maneuverability. The Sherman tank was a great tank as far as that part is concerned. But we needed the mobility for obvious reasons.
The Adriatic sector of the Gothic Line consists of an anti-tank ditch, river barriers that run at right angles across the front, barbed wire entanglements, extensive minefields.
But what this section of the line lacks is enough German troops to properly defend it.
On the morning of August 31st, the German reinforcements are being rushed in from other parts of Italy now that the Germans know where the main Allied effort is coming. There's an awareness in Allied headquarters and Canadian headquarters that they've got to get high into the hills and take the German depth positions before the German reinforcements arrive.
The Canadians will cross the Folia Valley, heading towards the heights of Point 204, near the town of Tomba di Pesaro.
The Canadians understand that the key to their section of the Gothic Line are the heights around Tomba di Pesaro. The British Columbia Dragoons are supposed to attack up on those heights with a supporting battalion of infantry. That battalion isn't ready, so they make the decision to go alone. It's a costly decision. It means that they have to drive through a German anti-tank gun screen and thick concentrations of German artillery fire.
Even without reinforcements, the Germans are ready for the Canadians.
The worst part was the fact that they were entrenched in there and were waiting for us.
On the neighboring ridges on both sides of them, German anti-tank guns, machine guns, mortars, and artillery are working to stop them and pick off a large number of BCD Shermans, toppling some down the ridge side and picking off others on the crest of the ridge itself.
Before reaching the German lines, the Shermans must cross a minefield.
We lost one tank, hit one of these mines, and poof. What they would do is knock off the track. And of course, it was no good after that.
The British Columbia Dragoons are attacking up a ridge towards Point 204. The Dragoons make rather skillful use of the crest of the ridge itself. To expose themselves on the crest itself means certain death. So when at all possible, they keep the vehicles on the right side of the crest and shield themselves from the German anti-tank guns to the west.
Anti-tank guns, either side, they were firing at us.
Some aren't able to do it. At some points on the top of that ridge, it's impossible to stay on the right-hand side. You have to expose yourself across the peak, and at those times, those tanks are picked off by 88s.
That 88 millimeter, that was a powerful, deadly thing.
A number of tanks actually make it to Point 204.
And that's when we saw the big Panther tank. Only hit we got was just a glancing blow off the side of the tank. Wham! The noise inside was quite loud. It was facing us, and when I saw us, all three of us coming after them, he started to turn. But it didn't get very far. Crew commander said, fire it well. So I'm slamming the shells in, and the gun is firing away. In with another one. We hit a broadside, and in the turret.
Once the Canadians carve out a toehold on Point 204, they've effectively cracked their finger into the door of the Gothic Line.
The Germans begin a massive withdrawal. The supposedly invincible Gothic Line has been smashed.
After their victory in the Gothic Line, the Canadians thought the war with Germany just might be over. They assumed that the Germans were retreating from the Gothic Line and were about to abandon all of Italy. In fact, at that moment, German reinforcements were rushing to restore the front and keep the Allies from breaking into the Po Valley and setting up a new line of defense around a place called Coriano. And the heaviest of the fighting was about to break out.
September 1944. The Allies are on the verge of breaking through into the Italian north. They plan a massive push along the Adriatic coastal plain. But first, they must clear German positions that overlook the coast, near the hilltop town of Coriano.
The town of Coriano lies atop a ridge that bars the Allied approach northward to the Po Valley. And the ridge itself is an excellent place for a defensive position.
Allied command believes the Coriano Ridge is vulnerable.
They thought it was going to be a cakewalk through Coriano.
But the Canadians soon discover that Coriano is anything but lightly defended. The Germans throw in every available elite unit, including the Canadians' old foe from Ortona, the 1st Parachute Division.
We found the parachute divisions were the worst ones of all for us, because they would never give up.
I had heard some Canadian prisoners say, the Paras are very tough.
The Paras are very hard, haben die gesagt.
So, they said we were very tough.
Very hard.
So we started out into the valley, and we no sooner got over the Bassano Ridge than they started whaling hell out of us.
I was the artillery observer for the 11th Company of the 1st Parachute Division, and I had 2 radio operators with me. All of a sudden, we heard tanks from the front. So we looked, and I counted 50 tanks.
50 Panzer gezählt. 50.
After we had given an order by radio, it took about 10 minutes until some artillery arrived.
The Canadian advance is totally exposed to the fire of German guns.
We were out there bare naked.
And when the first ones caught on fire, the other ones turned around.
2 B Squadron tanks from the 8th Hussars make a break for the bottom of the hill.
When we got down there, Brewster's tank and our tank got there about the same time. And we rubbed against one another. And we straddled this dry creek bed. Well, it was a natural tank trap, really. We couldn't get out of there.
The stranded B Squadron tanks are assisted by the tanks of A Squadron, positioned on the ridge above them. A Squadron lays down a smoke screen, giving the men of B Squadron the cover they need to abandon their tanks and escape on foot.
By the grace of God, we hit our lines, so we got away with it. None of our crew even got a scratch there. I feel I was very lucky to get out of that thing.
The Germans successfully repel the Canadian attack of September the 4th.
We fought off those attacks. They did not get through.
But the cost to the Germans is great. In spite of the huge loss of men and equipment, the Germans are ordered to hold.
Man hat seine Pflicht getan und
we just did our duties.
Hat geglaubt, dass wir vielleicht
and kept on believing that we would get out of there okay.
Einigermaßen davonkommen.
September 13th. The Germans face a second Canadian attack on Coriano Ridge.
In the second battle for Coriano, 15 Hussar Shermans penetrate into the center of town, assuming that the Germans have started to abandon Coriano Ridge. In fact, they find that the Germans are intent on clinging to Coriano at all costs. Those 15 Hussar Shermans reach the town square and meet an ambush force of German Tigers, Panzer IVs, and infantry.
We would let them come close, without firing at them. Then, when they got very close, we would fire.
And now the Shermans must face the most dreaded tank in the German arsenal, the fearsome Tiger. The 57-ton Tiger is the jewel of Germany's Panzer force. At 100 millimeters, its frontal armor is twice as thick as the Sherman's. And its 88-millimeter gun is much more powerful than the 75-millimeter cannon on the Sherman.
There was some kind of a weapon, Tiger tank. Shells just bounced off them.
They engage in a violent close-quarter battle in the town square itself. A number of Canadian tanks are hit.
The Canadians were very hard-pressed. Even though they outnumbered us by far.
And in order to escape, the Hussars actually have to tow their wrecks out of the way.
Under heavy fire, the Shermans retreat from Coriano. For the remainder of the day, their tank guns shell the Germans from the outskirts of town. The next morning, they mount another assault.
The whole of 5th Canadian Armored Division regroups and goes back into Coriano. By this point, the German tanks inside Coriano have been wrecked by Canadian artillery.
After a day and night of vicious, pitiless struggle, Coriano and its ridge are finally in Canadian hands. Just on the horizon, the Po Valley beckons. The men call it the Promised Land. After the battle for Coriano, the Allies are finally on the edge of the vast Po Valley. Being flat, the valley looks like ideal tank country.
When the Canadians finally broke it into the Po Valley, many of them thought that for the first time in this war, they were going to be able to fight a battle without the Germans looking down on them. Tankers had been dreaming of the day when they'd be able to use their tanks in a breakout role and chase the Germans back to the Alps. Unfortunately, that was not going to be the case.
The desperate German fight at Coriano had a clear aim. The Germans were waiting for the season to change. Autumn weather and rain will be the Germans' greatest ally in defending the Po Valley.
Po Valley is a tanker's paradise in the summer dry weather. But because of all the rivers and irrigation canals that cut across it, once the fall rains arrive, it's a tanker's nightmare. Once it starts to rain heavily in September and October of 1944, the Po Valley filled with water. Any attempt to move off-road means that a 33-ton Sherman tank is going to bog down to its axles almost immediately. Tanks become irrelevant.
You thought it was going to be easy, but it didn't turn out that easy.
Mud makes coordinated cross-country tank attacks almost impossible. The Germans dig in, and the Allied advance slows to a crawl. Both sides hunker down in the rain and the mud. For almost 2 months, the stalemate lasts.
It's not until the very end of 1944 that we see tanks once again employed in an off-road role to play a leading part in any major battle.
Finally, the Italian winter arrives. The ground freezes up, and tanks once more become mobile.
The next task is going to be to break out across the Po Valley and chase what they think is going to be a German evacuation from Italy.
But the Germans have no intention of evacuating Italy. In fact, they plan to fight for every inch, including a bulge in their line south of Lake Camacchio. The German position near the town of Sant Alberto, on the south shore of Lake Camacchio, is a mortal danger to the Allies' right flank. The Canadians prepare to eliminate that threat.
The Canadian mission at the Battle of Lake Camacchio is to destroy the German forces south of the lake and set the conditions for the final liberation drive in the spring of 1945.
January 2nd, 1945. Canadian tanks go into action.
5th Canadian Armored Division uses 2 of its armored regiments. They wait until there's been several successive nights of frost to freeze the ground firm. Because they know that German anti-tank defenses are only set up to cover the roads, because for the last 3 months, no Allied tank has been able to drive off-road. After a couple of days of frost, when the ground's firm enough to carry the weight of a Sherman, these Canadian Shermans break out across the frozen ground.
Frost-hardened ground is not their only ally. The Shermans have been fitted with track grousers to aid the advance.
The track grouser extends the width of the Sherman track and enables it to travel on softer ground.
Additional pieces attached to the sides of the track links. Grousers add more than 10 centimeters to the width of the tank track, thus spreading the weight of the tank and making it less likely it will sink into soft ground or break through the frost layer. As the Canadians advance across the frozen ground, they come under fire from a German ambush. A group of anti-tank guns and Panthers begin to knock out the tanks of the 8th Hussars. Sergeant Daniel McCaskill, crew commander of one of the Shermans, acts quickly. He stops his tank and opens fire on the German positions. As he exchanges shell fire with the Germans, the rest of his squadron continues to advance. McCaskill's Sherman single-handedly knocks out 4 anti-tank guns and a Panther, while sustaining no damage himself. With the Shermans safely through the ambush zone, they continue their advance towards Lake Camacchio, leaving the German defenses in flames.
The Canadians have penetrated past any of the German defenses that can stop them and race to Lake Camacchio.
When the Canadians enter Sant Alberto, completely sealing off the southern shore of Lake Camacchio, they have taken 600 enemy prisoners and counted at least 300 enemy dead.
Lake Camacchio constitutes the last big battle for Canada in the Italian campaign. The Italian campaign is the longest fought by the Canadian Army in the Second World War. And it was tremendously successful at drawing in and tying down some of the best formations in the German army.
We really weren't expected to win the war. Our job was to take the strength out of Europe. And in view of the fact that there were from 30 to 40 divisions, German divisions sent to fight in Italy, we did a great job in taking strength away. And of course, we were causing tremendous casualties, which they had to reinforce, and they were using tanks and they were using ammunition. So we were sapping a lot of strength out of Europe.
The Italian campaign saw some of the most famous armored regiments in Canadian history earn their spurs and prove their ability in the Italian landscape to win some of the most important Canadian tank victories of the Second World War.
Each Canadian victory was a step in the liberation of Italy. And many Italians, like those who live near what was once the Gothic Line, still remember, even today.
The Italians in that area remember the Canadian victory at Point 204 as a key point in the story of their liberation from German occupation. The Italians built the monument at Point 204 in tribute to their Canadian liberators, with their own money and their own labor. It's a unique monument in Europe in that sense.
The memorial's inscription reads, "Here the heroic deeds of the 1st Canadian Corps breached the imposing German defenses, with the loss of over 1,000 lives, for the freedom of Italy and peace in Europe. In witness to, and as a warning for future generations." The Gothic Line was just one battle in the 20 long months the Canadians fought to liberate Italy.
That success came at a heavy price in Canadian lives.
93,000 Canadians served in Italy. More than 20,000 were wounded. Nearly 6,000 died.
Those are brave men.
We didn't think we were heroes. I was a lucky guy to survive. Each year I go to the memorial service for the 23 of my synagogue that got killed in action.
I guess I'm lucky to be where I am. All my buddies in the regiment are all dead. And that's not a very nice thing to even think about. They're excellent people, excellent soldiers.
We did what we had to do, and what we were trying to do was prevent the Germans from taking over the whole world, and we succeeded.
It was really our baptismal fire.
Michael Wittmann is the most famous tank commander of the Third Reich.
He was the most decorated German tank ace of the war.
At Kursk, the greatest tank battle in history, he spearheads the attack.
Wittmann just accumulated kill after kill.
In Normandy, Wittmann single-handedly halts an Allied advance.
One German tank was able to knock out so many British tanks in a matter of a few minutes.
Wittmann's final battle turns him into a Nazi legend.
It was almost suicidal for the Germans to mount that attack.
Even though it's been 60 years after Wittmann's death, his legacy, his mystique, maintains today.
Le Cam German Military Cemetery, Normandy, France. 21,000 graves, a monument to the death of the German army in Normandy and to the downfall of Adolf Hitler's reviled Third Reich. And yet amongst the rows of unadorned gravestones, there is one man's grave that is always honored with fresh flowers. His name, Michael Wittmann. Wittmann is considered the greatest tank ace of all time.
He was the ace of aces. Many people say that he was a very quiet, likable man. He wasn't your typical Nazi.
Most tank commanders weren't personally decorated by Hitler. but most didn't quite stand out with the number of kills that Wittmann did. Wittmann's mentality was aggressive, motivated, disciplined, kind of encapsulates the Panzer arm of World War II into a person.
Wittmann died here in the fields of Normandy. But his legend began in the fields of Bavaria. Born in 1914 on a farm south of Nuremberg, Wittmann was a country boy living the healthy outdoor life. At 19, Wittmann is drafted into the army for compulsory service, as all young men are in the Germany of Adolf Hitler. In 1937, after completing his service, Michael Wittmann, aged 23, eagerly volunteers for Hitler's personal bodyguard, the Leibstandarte, SS Adolf Hitler.
It's an elite unit. They were in parades, they were very regimented. It would have been hand-picked personnel. They would have had certain height and physical fitness requirements, a certain look. He's not only a volunteer, but he's seemingly politically indoctrinated to want to be part of this unit.
I swear to thee, Adolf Hitler, as Führer and Chancellor of the German Reich, loyalty and bravery. I vow to thee obedience unto death.
Being the honor guard, I'm sure it was very appealing to somebody in their early 20s. With the black uniforms and the smart look and the whole elite quality about them.
Michael Wittmann embraces absolute loyalty to Adolf Hitler and his policy of persecution of the Jews, and to his program of conquest and expansion of the Third Reich. But in September 1939, Hitler invades Poland, triggering the Second World War. Now for Wittmann and his generation of young Nazis, the parades are over and the fighting begins. Because of his excellence as a driver, Wittmann is given command of a reconnaissance vehicle. By early summer 1941, the Nazis are the masters of Europe. But for Adolf Hitler, the real prize lies to the east, the Soviet Empire, vast spaces for the master race to conquer and colonize. June 22nd, 1941, Hitler invades the Soviet Union. Codename Operation Barbarossa. 3 million German soldiers, led by 3,600 tanks, plunge into the Soviet Union. Against the Germans, the Soviets mobilize 2.9 million men and 20,000 tanks. Despite their superior numbers, the Soviets are quickly overwhelmed by the speed and skill of the German Panzers. Michael Wittmann's reconnaissance unit races over the Soviet frontier with the Leibstandarte, part of the leading armored force.
Hitler's armored divisions were important in the fact that they were the ones that were spearheading the advances. The whole mentality of the tank force was always keep moving.
Wittmann and the Leibstandarte are now part of the notorious Waffen SS.
The Waffen SS had a few premier divisions, Leibstandarte being one of them, that maintained its elite status throughout the war.
As the Panzers slash hundreds of kilometers through Russian defenses, millions of prisoners are taken.
The Waffen SS does have a reputation for committing atrocities on the Eastern Front.
Over 3 million will be shot or starved to death. 3 weeks after the invasion, the Leibstandarte is closing in on the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. At the forefront is Reconnaissance Sergeant Michael Wittmann. July 12, 1941. The Panzers advance over hilly, wooded country. As they near the city of Zhytomyr, 200 kilometers southwest of Kiev, the Soviets counterattack. Dozens of Soviet T-34 tanks bear down on the Leibstandarte. The T-34 has been a shock for the Germans. Weighing 26 tons, the T-34 is heavily armored with sloping sides to deflect shells. Armed with a powerful 76.2 millimeter gun, it is better than anything the Germans can field. Wittmann is ordered to reconnoiter the enemy forces in a Sturmgeschütz 3 or Stug.
Wittmann drove his Sturmgeschütz to high ground to try to locate the Soviets. He spotted 2 groups of Soviet T-34 tanks, 6 coming from northeast and another 12 from the east. That meant 18 T-34s against Wittmann's single assault gun. It was no match. Wittmann had to act quickly to even the odds. He ordered his driver to take the Sturmgeschütz off the high ground.
Wittmann has been ordered not to engage the enemy tanks, as the heavier T-34s outgun his Sturmgeschütz 3.
Sturmgeschütz is designed initially to be infantry support. It's not designed to engage other tanks.
Built on the chassis of a Panzer III, the Stug is a turretless assault gun, which means the driver has to swing the whole vehicle around to aim its high-velocity 75 millimeter cannon.
The Sturmgeschütz has a movable cannon of 24 degrees only. You have to face the enemy straight forward, not from the side. If you see the enemy, you have to turn.
Despite being outnumbered and outmatched by the Russian tanks, Wittmann disobeys his orders and attacks the T-34s.
His personality that was mated to the Panzer credo of attack, that would have been the first thing he was looking for, was an opportunity to be preempted.
As the T-34 surged forward towards the crest of the hill, Wittmann's only hope was to set up an ambush. It was a direct hit. A second T-34 surged over the hill. It went up in flames. A third T-34 managed to get a shot at Wittmann's Sturmgeschütz.
The T-34s were not as accurate, we thought at least, than ours.
More Russian tanks poured forward. There were just too many. Wittmann headed for cover. He used the assault gun's low profile to hide it in a small wood.
I liked the Sturmgeschütz because of the low silhouette. And that gave me a feeling being safer.
But facing so many T-34s, there was nowhere for him to hide. Wittmann's driver swiveled the Stug to bring its gun to bear on the Russian.
Firing would have definitely been an issue because of the inability to track a target via a turret. You would have to maneuver the vehicle.
And again, his gunner scored a direct hit.
With the T-34. The only weak part is between the turret and the body, to get right into the crack.
Another T-34 tried to target the thin side armor on the Sturmgeschütz. Wittmann had to turn quickly and fire before the Russian got in a shot.
You hit the tracks if you can. When the tracks burst, of course, he just goes around in a circle.
With his fast maneuvering, Wittmann began to even the odds. Then, 3 more enemy tanks attacked. Wittmann opened fire. Only one of the Soviet tanks escaped.
6 of the formidable T-34s destroyed in just a few minutes. Wittmann and his crew stopped the Soviet armored attack. For his actions, Wittmann is awarded the Iron Cross Second Class. Impressed by his exploits, Wittmann's commanders send him back to Germany to train to become an officer of the SS. Wittmann's career is on the rise. Autumn 1942, Bad Tölz, Germany. Michael Wittmann begins his training in Heinrich Himmler's Waffen SS school. Its aim is to form a new SS military elite, the future leaders of Hitler's Nazi empire. Wittmann graduates as an SS second lieutenant and is soon training on Germany's newest tank, the Tiger. Hitler's answer to the Soviet T-34, it is the most formidable tank in the world. At 100 millimeters, the Tiger's frontal armor is virtually impregnable. Its 88 millimeter gun can cut through a T-34 at over 2 kilometers.
Wir waren und Tigerleute, waren stolz, hatten das beste Gerät, was wir hatten. Es war auch ein guter Panzer und wir waren zum ersten Mal den russischen Panzern haushoch überlegen.
In February 1943, Wittmann is called back to the Russian front as part of the Leibstandart's new Tiger Company. But by the summer, the tide of battle is turning against Germany. Soviet forces surge west, creating a huge bulge protruding into the German lines near the Russian city of Kursk. Desperate to regain the initiative, Adolf Hitler plans a counteroffensive, Operation Citadel. It will be a two-pronged attack from north and south to chop off the bulge, leaving 500,000 Soviet soldiers cut off and trapped. For the Citadel offensive, the Germans have amassed 780,000 men and 2,500 tanks. To meet the Germans, the Soviets field almost 2 million men and more than 5,000 tanks. The Leibstandart will be at the front of the southern attack. With them at the spearhead will be Michael Wittmann, now commanding a platoon of 5 Tiger tanks. On the eve of battle, Wittmann's commander reads out Adolf Hitler's message to the crews.
Soldiers, today you set out on a great offensive, whose result can decisively affect the outcome of the war. My soldiers, now, finally, you have better tanks than the enemy. The German homeland looks to you with ardent confidence.
We just thought we were superior to the Russian tanks. At least we were brainwashed to believe that, which helps to make you feel superior, you know. You know what propaganda does.
July 5th, 1943. At dawn, the Tiger crews wait for their attack to begin.
The order came over the tank radios. Panzers, forward! As we advanced, we were met by a relentless storm of fire. The Russians had prepared line after line of defenses, with dug-in T-34s.
Because the T-34 was inferior to the Tiger I, it needed to compensate for its deficiencies. One of the ways was to have pre-dug positions for the vehicles. The incoming round would have to penetrate several feet of dirt to be able to actually get to the vehicle itself.
The Tiger's powerful 88 millimeter gun is able to break through the Russian defenses. While the Russian shells bounce off the Tiger's armor.
Overcoming line after line of Russian defense, Wittmann and the Tigers pushed towards their objective. But the Russians continued to throw wave after wave of tanks at our advance. These were all fresh targets for Wittmann's gunner. Wittmann's tank kept moving, firing as it turned, smashing one T-34 after another.
Knocking out 8 tanks and 12 anti-tank guns, this first day of battle has been a success for Wittmann and his elite crew.
We call it zusammengespielt, played together, so that one interacts with the other the right way. The loader, the gunner, the commander, the driver, the radio man. It's a tightly knit group.
July 12, 1943. The Germans set off to assault the final Soviet defense line before Kursk. Wittmann's commander is wounded, and Wittmann must take over command of the Leibstandart's Tiger Company, just as the Battle of Kursk is about to reach its climax. Unknown to the Germans, the Russians are preparing a desperate last-ditch counterattack.
The Germans were on the verge of breaking through into open country, and the Soviets were starting to panic. They were going to throw whatever they had available into the mix.
The Russians send 500 tanks west to attack the German right flank, but the Waffen SS tanks turn east. These huge tank forces are about to collide near the little town of Prokhorovka. Second Lieutenant Wittmann and his crew are ordered to high ground.
In the distance, what seemed like a dust cloud was rising. Suddenly, hundreds of Soviet tanks appeared at the crest of a hill, headed straight towards Wittmann. We were in shock. The Soviets were not on the defensive, they were attacking.
Just 1,600 meters from Wittmann, more than 100 Soviet tanks are charging towards him over the gently rolling land of the steppe.
We had a number of hills, but it was predominantly open terrain, so the Tiger tank could engage at long distance.
With a well-aimed shot, a Tiger can knock out a T-34 at a distance of 2 kilometers. But the Russian tanks have to get much closer before their guns can have any effect on the Tigers.
Wir kamen im Angriff, man muss sich das so vorstellen, Panzer an Panzer, die große Kette, und auf der anderen Seite kam die T-34 an.
The T-34s raced towards us, trying to close the deadly gap. They came back into view, now only 800 meters away. The Tigers opened fire.
A lot of tanks in a relatively small area. Something of a shooting gallery from a Tiger I commander's perspective.
The T-34s were still not close enough to penetrate the armor of the Tigers, so they had to keep advancing, straight through our barrage. They got to 700 meters. Getting closer. And closer. The Tiger guns were belching fire, but there were too many. They couldn't all be stopped.
В это время немцы уже наступали, немецкие войска. Они были на ходу.
The Russians slam into the SS formation.
Они рассчитывали, что мы в контратаке это будем, а тут хлестнули две массы.
At close range, the German tanks are vulnerable. Wittmann's Tigers spring into action. Wittmann's gunner fires on the move, again and again.
One of the reasons that Wittmann was so successful as a Tiger commander was his ability to fire while moving with the vehicle. And that way they could acquire the target, but they'd get rounds on the target more quickly. Such a technique wasn't normal. In fact, German regulations stressed that the tanks should not fire when on the move. It's basically a waste of ammunition.
But Wittmann and his crew have mastered the difficult technique, using it to their advantage.
From Wittmann's perspective, Prokhorovka would have just been chaos. He would have had firing at close range.
Wittmann's tank is hit twice, but keeps on fighting.
Gemetzelt auf beiden Seiten, Panzer auf Panzer.
The battle rages for hours. The Russians take appalling losses. But they succeed in slowing the German advance.
Бомбила наша авиация, бомбила немецкая. Я думал, что они, наверное, даже цель не искали. Бросали бомбы и все.
Kursk is considered one of the greatest tank battles in history because of the numbers of tanks and other armored vehicles involved in a relatively small area.
Our Tiger Company had a series of fine successes. Over the whole Citadel Kursk battle, we destroyed 151 enemy tanks.
Despite the success of the Tiger units, the ferocious Russian defenses has stopped Hitler's offensive. The Germans have lost the decisive tank battle on the Eastern Front. From now on, Michael Wittmann will be fighting for his and for Nazi Germany's survival. In its third winter on the Eastern Front, the German army is in full retreat. The Russians have pushed them 500 kilometers from Kursk back into the Ukraine. Michael Wittmann's Tiger unit is fighting a series of desperate rearguard actions.
Tiger units would have been sent from one sector of the front to the other to try and plug gaps that had been opened up by Soviet armored forces, and attempted to blunt them so that way German forces can continue their retreat to the west.
The rapid Russian advance leaves the Soviet supply lines stretched dangerously thin, making supply convoys a vital necessity. December 6, 1943. Wittmann and his unit, now designated the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion, are poised to attack a Soviet supply convoy near the town of Brusilov. But between the convoy and the Tigers are batteries of Russian anti-tank guns. The Soviet 76.2 millimeter divisional gun is a tank killer. It can smash through a Tiger's side armor at a distance of nearly 1,000 meters and wreck its tracks. To kill these anti-tank batteries, Wittmann's tactic is to play a dangerous game, using himself and his tank as bait.
Wittmann drove to high ground. He was tempting the Russian gunners to fire at him. They took the bait, but now the gunners had revealed their positions. Under heavy fire, Wittmann quickly retreated. Then our Tigers raced at the anti-tank guns from their blind spots, charging straight at them before the Russians could turn the guns around.
Wittmann's tactic has worked. The anti-tank batteries are now a smoking wreck. But his Tiger reveals just how dangerous Wittmann's game can be.
We counted a total of 28 hits on the Tiger. Some of them were smaller, of course, but there were also some big enough to easily put one's fist into.
With the anti-tank batteries eliminated, Wittmann races towards the supply road. He drives into cover to observe the road, and he spots a convoy. Though he's heavily outnumbered, Wittmann decides to attack on his own.
Wittmann would have been trying to make the best of a bad situation. He would have been increasingly reckless due to necessity in engaging enemy targets.
Like a wolf attacking its prey, he quickly knocks out the lead tank and the rear tank, leaving the convoy trapped on the road at his mercy.
Wittmann blasted the enemy with furious barrages of gunfire. He placed his fiery mark on the road, smashing long lines of Soviet vehicles into junk. This caused mass confusion amongst the Soviets.
Wittmann's daring lone wolf attack has worked brilliantly. The Russian convoy has been destroyed. Over the next few weeks, he goes on a rampage, knocking out 61 enemy tanks. His total kills soon reach 117. He paints the number of kills on his tank barrel. On January 16, 1944, Wittmann is awarded the Knight's Cross, Nazi Germany's second highest military honor. Then, just a few weeks later, his Knight's Cross is upgraded with oak leaves, and he is promoted to first lieutenant. On February 2, 1944, Wittmann is called to the Führer's Eastern Front headquarters to receive his new commendation from Adolf Hitler himself.
I think one of the reasons that Wittmann was decorated to the degree that he was that he was part of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler Division, and that's Hitler's name in the unit.
Wittmann is now ordered back to Germany, where his exploits have already made him famous. But the country he finds upon his return is in ruins, a result of Allied bombing.
The sight of such senseless destruction of our cities is enough to make one's heart bleed. The Anglo-Americans have taught us to hate. They will see this hate transformed into energy. We desire one thing: to get them in front of our guns. We have only one watchword, and that is revenge.
The war effort was definitely going against Germany, and they were looking for ways to keep up the public morale. He visited the Henschel factory where the Tiger One was made and made a speech to the workers there. I think Wittmann was used as propaganda for the Nazi Party, but I don't think it was totally unwilling on his part. I think it was just another way of contributing to the war effort. The Reich made him a celebrity intentionally.
During his triumphal tour of Germany, Wittmann marries 19-year-old Hildegard Burmester. The couple is offered a special wedding gift: Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf.
Hitler went to Wittmann's wedding. A tank ace in Germany was so important.
Before he can arrange a honeymoon for his young bride, Wittmann receives a new posting. So his wife accompanies him with his Tiger Battalion to the Chateau Elbeuf in Normandy, France. Michael Wittmann will soon have his chance at revenge on Germany's enemies. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces land in Normandy. Hitler orders his panzer forces to drive the Allies back into the sea. For Michael Wittmann and his Tigers, the Allied beachhead is over 200 kilometers away.
Wittmann started off on June 6th with 45 Tiger tanks, which is a full complement for that 101st Heavy SS Tank Battalion.
But it takes Wittmann 5 harrowing days to get his second company to the Normandy battlefield, under unrelenting attacks by Allied fighter bombers that decimate his forces.
A week later, it was down to about 6 vehicles that were serviceable.
Wittmann and the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion are positioned on the left and most crucial sector of the front, facing the British and the Canadians.
The Germans would have concentrated their armored units around the British and Canadian sector, because if that sector had fallen, that would have been the shortest route to Germany. So they had to hold that with their stronger units.
The Allies are preparing the break out of the beachhead. Their plan is to send the British 7th Armored Division towards the key city of Caen, through the town of Villers-Bocage. June 13th, 1944. Sheltering from Allied bombers, Wittmann positions his surviving Tigers under the cover of trees, near Villers-Bocage.
The British 22nd Armored Brigade was moving through the town.
The column of British tanks is just 200 meters from Wittmann's position. The British do not know Wittmann is there, but they are about to find out.
Then a man came into the command post and said, "Obersturmführer, tanks are driving past. I don't think they're German." I had no idea that the enemy might suddenly appear.
Wittmann saw that there was an opportunity and that the British armored vehicles were in a nice, neat line approaching his position.
I went outside and saw English and American tanks rolling past, about 150 to 200 meters distance. Never had I been so impressed by the strength of the enemy as I was by those tanks rolling by.
Wittmann is facing 138 tanks and armored vehicles, while he has only 6 tanks.
The decision to attack was a very difficult one, but I knew it absolutely had to be, and I decided to strike out at the enemy.
Wittmann's split-second decision will become legendary.
I had no time to assemble my company. I set off with 1 tank. I drove up to the column, surprised the English as much as they had surprised me. I first knocked out 2 tanks from the right of the column, then 1 from the left.
With them being in such close proximity to each other, there was no room to maneuver.
I then turned about to the left and attacked the armored troop carriers in the middle of the armored regiment. They never left the road. They were so surprised that they took to flight, but not with their vehicles. Instead, they jumped out, and I shot up the battalion's vehicles as I drove by. I drove towards the rear of the column on the same road, knocking out every tank that came toward me. The enemy was thrown into total confusion. I was able to take out tanks as well as armored troop carriers. Then I drove straight into the town of Villers-Bocage.
The town has already been occupied by British armor. Wittmann continues his single-handed attack, claiming a total of 21 Allied tanks destroyed.
I got to approximately the center of town, where I was hit by an anti-tank gun. My tank was disabled. I fired at and destroyed everything around me that I could reach. I then abandoned the tank.
Wittmann's deadly rampage has lasted barely 15 minutes, but he has devastated an entire enemy regiment.
By single-handedly knocking out the British column, it kept the Allies from taking the area around Caen for 2 months, and it added to the mystique of Wittmann's abilities as a panzer commander.
German newsreels make the most of the Allied setback at Villers-Bocage.
In den engen Straßen wurde eine stärkere amerikanische Panzereinheit gestellt und zusammengeschossen.
Wittmann is the most famous tank officer in the German army.
Rund 1000
But the following day, the stress of battle shows on his face. Wittmann is celebrated for his astounding feat by 1st SS Panzer Corps commander Sepp Dietrich, who recommends him for yet another commendation. In July, Wittmann is once again personally decorated by Hitler, this time adding 2 swords to his Knight's Cross with oak leaves.
Wittmann was the most decorated tank commander, not only for his experience on the battlefield, but I would think also for the propaganda value that could be showcased through him.
And so Michael Wittmann reaches the height of his fame in Normandy. And it is in Normandy that his fate and his myth will be sealed. August 8th, 1944, 2 months after Villers-Bocage. Michael Wittmann is now a captain and acting commander of his battalion. Yet as Wittmann's career soars, Hitler's army in Normandy is headed towards destruction. Now the Allies launch a decisive punch, codenamed Operation Totalize. British and Canadian armor storms along the Caen-Falaise road, smashing 14 kilometers through the German lines towards the village of Sinto. As 300 Allied tanks bear down on Sinto, the 12th SS Panzer Division is ordered to bar their advance. With the remnants of the heavily outnumbered division is Captain Michael Wittmann, with a small group of Tiger tanks. The division's leader, Colonel Kurt Mayer, now orders an immediate counterattack.
Wittmann's Tigers were standing ready behind a hedge east of Sinto. We had to risk the attack in order to win time.
It was almost suicidal for the Germans to mount that attack, but this was their system. If they were hit, they would hit back immediately.
Wittmann is in reserve, but he insists on leading the attack.
Michael said to me, I must be in the attack myself, for the other officers can barely cope.
Kurt Mayer knows the situation is hopeless.
I shook Michael Wittmann's hand. Michael laughed his youthful laugh and climbed into his Tiger.
And so Michael Wittmann sets off on the attack. Just 8 German tanks advancing against 300 Allied tanks.
I don't think Wittmann is exactly a fatalist. I don't think that he just figured that he was going to die, maybe this was the best place to do it. Wittmann and probably his crew didn't think so much about their own personal safety as the overall war effort.
What Wittmann doesn't know is there is a hidden danger waiting for him on either side of the Caen-Falaise road. British tanks of the Northamptonshire Yeomanry are lying in wait in the woods to his right. Canadian tanks of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers are hidden behind a wall to his left.
We drove off, Michael right of the road and I left of the road. Approximately 800 meters to Michael's right, there was a small wood, which looked suspicious.
British tanks hidden in the woods observe Wittmann.
There were certainly four Tigers, which came down on what would have been our side of the main road. The Canadians of the Sherbrooks were, as far as I can see, actually much nearer, but they were on the other side of the main road.
The Canadian tanks are hidden from Wittmann's view behind a long chateau wall.
We sneaked up right beside a brick wall and got in reasonable cover. Just hit the wall just enough that you could get your gun, that you could move it sufficiently. I could see on the right the first German tanks came out from Sinzo. Right away, I can remember the wireless net becoming active. I can see them, I can see them.
I saw these Tigers come in, across in front of us, about 1,200 yards away. My tank commander, he said, well, wait till they get to about 800 yards.
We drove about 1 to 1.5 kilometers.
I was now starting to get a bit itchy.
The Allies not only have the element of surprise, they have a new tank, the Sherman Firefly. The Firefly, upgunned with a powerful 17-pounder cannon, is able to penetrate 130 millimeters of steel. Enough for even the thickest armor on a Tiger.
For the first time, we realized that we now had a tank which was equal to the Tiger.
Wittmann's Tigers are now in the kill zone.
With my eyes, I could see the tank closest to the road, about 200 yards, I guess.
The tank commander said, advance driver, and we pull out of cover. As we pull out of cover, he says, target the rear Tiger. I fired.
We began taking heavy fire, and then I received a radio message from Michael.
Achtung! Achtung! Von rechts!
I'd look round at the second tank. I fired one shot at the second tank. The loader reloads. Again, fired when ready.
3 of the 4 Tigers are now knocked out. Wittmann's tank moves on alone. From close range, the Canadians now open fire at Wittmann's tank.
The one that he was in, I think, went by me. Other people from my squadron were firing at it now.
Wittmann's Tiger is hit.
When I got to within 300 meters of Michael's Tiger, flames suddenly shot from the tank.
I can remember a tremendous explosion and seeing the turret hit the ground.
August 8th, 1944. Michael Wittmann has fought his final battle.
Whether his last thoughts as he went down the road were simply, Valhalla, here I come, a sort of a death wish. He must have known there was no way they were going to win.
August 25th, just days after Wittmann's death, the German army in Normandy is defeated. Many of Hitler's soldiers remain in Normandy, buried in La Cam German Military Cemetery. Somber gravestones recall the unheralded end of the Nazi Empire. Yet Michael Wittmann is still celebrated.
I think there's a myth to Michael Wittmann's combat experiences. People look at him as, yes, being a Nazi, but it's not the reason that they admire his abilities in combat. I think if you're on the receiving end of that, you're going to have a different perspective.
He accepted the doctrines of Hitler enough to get in his tank and invade other people's countries, country after country, to kill men, women, and children. He might have been a hero to the Germans, but not to me.
Even though it's been 60 years after Wittmann's death, his legacy, his mystique maintains to today.
I swear to thee, Adolf Hitler, as Führer and Chancellor of the German Reich, obedience unto death.
Vietnam, 1965. A brutal civil war is raging in Southeast Asia. Now American ground forces invade to stop communist guerrillas from overrunning the South.
There's a common misconception that tanks, were not used very much in Vietnam.
The Americans count on conventional firepower to stop the guerrillas. But they face a deadly, determined opponent.
The North Vietnamese, they knew what they were doing.
By itself, a tank is vulnerable in guerrilla and insurgent operations.
All of a sudden, the RPGs start flying.
And he screams, "We're hit!"
The Vietnam War represents the first great tank versus guerrilla series of battles.
And that's when all hell broke loose.
Vietnam, Southeast Asia. Today, it is a prosperous and peaceful nation. And in every city and town are images of Ho Chi Minh. They remind its people of the man who sought to create an independent country during decades of terrible fighting, in which millions of Vietnamese died. Throughout Vietnam are many remnants of that deadly past. War cemeteries, unexploded bombs and shells, and long-abandoned American tanks. In early 1965, the United States makes the fateful decision to send ground troops to Vietnam as tensions rise between the American-backed regime in the South and the Communist North, led by Ho Chi Minh. March 8, 1965. An expeditionary force of 3,500 Marines lands at Da Nang. Its mission is to defeat the North Vietnamese, who are on the verge of overrunning South Vietnam.
The U.S. saw that as part of this controversial domino effect in which if South Vietnam fell, next to fall would be Indonesia and the Philippines, and all of Asia would become communist. Whereas in reality, the Vietnamese simply saw this as a nationalistic war to reunite their country.
Landing with the Marines are 2 platoons of 3rd Tank Battalion armor.
There's a common misconception that tanks were not used very much in Vietnam. The Marines actually had a history of using tanks for infantry support that reached back to World War II. There's no real way to carry a large cannon around the battlefield, for direct fire infantry support, except a tank.
Infantry support in Vietnam will be provided by the M48 tank. The M48A3 Patton tank boasts a high-velocity 90mm main gun, 110 millimeters of frontal armor, and a top speed of 45 kilometers per hour.
The M48 was designed for tank-on-tank action. The goal of the American Tank Force in the 1960s was, in effect, to destroy Soviet tanks.
The Americans are prepared for head-to-head combat with the Russians. But in Vietnam, their tanks face a different kind of enemy. The Viet Cong, or VC.
The Viet Cong was a local guerrilla force, intimately familiar with the area. Their specialization was infiltration, ambushes.
The initial role of tanks in Vietnam is to protect U.S. air bases.
because the original commitment of the U.S. in Vietnam was to base aircraft in South Vietnam for airstrikes across into North Vietnam.
As the VCs step up their attacks against the air bases, U.S. Commander William Westmoreland adopts a new strategy.
Westmoreland was a World War II general with a World War II mentality. And his goal, as he saw it, was to bring the Vietnamese to a conventional battle in which they could be destroyed by conventional firepower, in which the U.S. excelled, of course.
He launches the first major American ground offensive of the war, Operation Starlight.
Intelligence indicated formations massing for additional attacks against airfields. So the idea was to go in and break these up.
Operation Starlight involves a preemptive strike against Viet Cong guerrillas who threaten the vital airbase at Chu Lai. The Viet Cong have 1,500 men, armed with hundreds of light anti-tank weapons. Against the VC, the Americans deploy an initial force of over 3,000 Marines, supported by a dozen tanks. August 18th, 1965. Marine tanks head inland to seek out the enemy. Confidence in the mission is high.
That's what we're there for. We're all excited to be going to war.
As the fighting rages, Marines in the field are soon in need of supplies. And tanks from the 1st Tank Battalion are called in.
We were going to provide security for 5 Amtraks that were loaded with sea rations and water. And we were to deliver those sea rations and water to our troops.
But the American commanders make a crucial error. Supply Column 21 heads off without any infantry support.
By itself, a tank is vulnerable in guerrilla and insurgent operations. To make a tank less vulnerable, one has to surround it with protective infantry.
Infantry support can deter an enemy from getting too close to the tanks.
Because a tank is relatively blind, if you can get up close to it, you can actually, deploy a number of anti-tank weapons.
As the convoy advances deeper into the jungle, it finds itself on a small trail.
The nature of the terrain restricted the movement of tanks.
Hundreds of VC guerrillas seize the opportunity to close in on the isolated convoy.
We're in a fairly dense, dark jungle. It wasn't very long that we were now taking small arms fire. You'd see muzzle flashes. We listened to the thwack, thwack, thwack of small arms fire hitting our tank. I was terrified. I couldn't see very well. It's like being in a paper bag with a little bitty pinhole to see out of, and you know there's bad stuff out there. I'm using my .30 caliber machine gun. I know that I don't have a lot of ammunition, because I'm trying to literally pick a target and hit it. My tank commander said, "We're coming to a clearing." I'm looking across a sunny opening. I'm looking at a rice paddy. But I see the first tank take either an anti-tank rocket or an anti-tank gun.
The Viet Cong have sprung a trap, a maneuver ambush. The maneuver ambush involves taking out the lead tank in a convoy, then the rear tank, then targeting the rest of the immobilized column. The first stage has worked. The lead tank has been halted.
Military warfare training tells you we're next. And bam, my tank commander screams, "We're hit! We're hit!" And he said, "Abandon tank." And I see Corporal Vickery's feet going out the top hatch. I get up and I look out the periscopes, and there's two guys just inside the edge of the jungle. He comes up and he fires a rocket and clangs off and bounces away. I turn back and look, and I can't get the gun down on him. He's too close to get down over the fenders.
The Viet Cong had a tactic known as hugging their enemy's belt. Close in so close that the tank cannot bring its main gun to bear.
The Marines are surrounded, and radio communication with headquarters is cut off. The lead tank is out of ammunition, and its crew wounded, so it pulls back to get help.
It rolled back into the jungle and was gone.
Hearn's lone tank is left to prevent the convoy from being annihilated by the Viet Cong.
I'm getting some black smoke in the turret. It's noxious. I decide it's time to get out. I stand up in there in a crouched position, and now I'm watching this 3.5 rocket launcher over here. He fires around. It hits just below the cupola, clangs off, climbed up and jumped out and jumped right over the back of the tank. There beside me is Corporal Vickery. He's on his hands and knees. He says, "Hearn, I'm hit. Hearn, I'm hit." It's obvious sooner or later they're just going to walk in and get us.
Supply Column 21 is down to a handful of Marines, struggling to hold off the VC. The final stage of the ambush begins. The Viet Cong close in for the kill.
And as I leaned up there, I take a bullet in the side of my neck. Much of the back of my head is blown out of my mouth.
Private Hearn is left for dead when the VC withdraw into the jungle. The next day, Hearn and the other survivors of Supply Column 21 are finally rescued. By the time Operation Starlight ends, Viet Cong losses are estimated at over 600 dead.
We underestimated them really, really badly. That was the case very early on in Vietnam. Operation Starlight was successful in that it did achieve its tactical goal, which was to break up units that were potentially massing for an attack on the airfields.
However, the U.S. Marines suffer 45 dead, and a quarter of their tankers are wounded or killed. (1967). The United States has increased its military forces in Vietnam to 400,000 troops and hundreds of tanks.
William Westmoreland was one of the main drivers in that he saw this as a conventional struggle and was constantly asking for more and more troops to expand these operational areas.
Ho Chi Minh counters the U.S. buildup by reinforcing Viet Cong insurgents with units of the regular North Vietnamese Army, or NVA.
The NVA were highly motivated. Their motto was, "Recruited in the North to die in the South." They were extremely disciplined, and they were better equipped than the Viet Cong. With Soviet weapons, complete with artillery and things like this.
The Americans must now stop thousands of NVA soldiers from infiltrating across the border into South Vietnam. They establish a series of fire bases along the 100-kilometer border that divides North and South Vietnam, known as the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ.
The demilitarized zone was an area that was supposed to be devoid of military forces and not used for military operations, effectively to separate North and South Vietnam.
The Marines started moving north to defend the areas around the DMZ and the major infiltration routes. So what you ended up with then was a face-off between the regular North Vietnamese formations and the Marine units along the DMZ.
Near the eastern end of the border is the Gia Linh fire base. It is protected by 5 M48s from the Marines' 3rd Tank Battalion.
As the U.S. began to establish a more far-flung network of bases, particularly along the DMZ, one of the things that would happen is they were subject to constant attacks by the NVA.
There was one time up at Gia Linh where we were getting hammered by artillery fire, more so than usual. Incoming was constant.
One of the chronic problems they faced was that the North Vietnamese artillery, the Soviet-made artillery, outranged even the larger American artillery. And frequently the tank cannons were the only things that could reply to that fire at extremely long ranges.
My tank commander came to us one morning and said, "Oh, we've got a crazy mission." And he said, "We're going to take our tank and one other tank, and we're going to run into North Vietnam. We're going to run through the DMZ."
Both forces were to remain outside and not operate within. But they were somewhat selective in their adherence to the treaty.
There were crack regiments of NVA in the area. We ended up perching ourselves on a little rise overlooking a huge expanse in North Vietnam. And our orders are to pick out any targets that seem suspicious and fire.
Now, the 90mm cannon was frequently used for harassment interdiction fire, where you would fire at long ranges against a fixed target that could not necessarily be hit by artillery or air power.
The rangefinder went up to 4,400 yards. I saw something on the other side of this old dried-up rice field. And I put the crosshairs on as best I could. And it landed well short. So I raised the crosshairs up and took another shot. And the second round or so hit. Even from 3 miles away or so. Secondary explosions were tremendous. We knew that we had hit something. We were there for maybe 3 minutes, turned around and hightailed it back to Gia Linh. We had knocked out the enemy artillery site that had been pounding the hill. We felt like the heroes of the hill, and it was something to be able to do that.
July 2nd, 1967. From their firebase at Con Thien, Alpha and Bravo companies, 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, set out towards the DMZ on an operation codenamed Buffalo. Their mission is to head northeast from Con Thien, cross the Trace, and then sweep the area south of the demilitarized zone.
The role of the Marines changed from defense to aggressive patrolling and seeking out the enemy along what they called the Trace, which was a cleared belt of terrain that ran parallel to the border between North and South Vietnam, simply because they knew that they could not defend these base areas unless they went out into the countryside and sought out the enemy.
As they advance, Bravo 19 has no idea they are walking towards a much larger force of battle-hardened troops of the North Vietnamese Army's 90th Regiment, waiting to ambush them.
Operation Buffalo represented 9-to-1 odds in favor of the North Vietnamese, which meant they could literally overwhelm the American company.
The NVA spring a trap on the American patrol. The Marines take heavy casualties and radio back for help from the tanks at Con Thien. Amongst them is the crew of Tank B-23.
They called on our 4 tanks that were stationed at Con Thien.
Bravo 19 was getting overrun.
They got themselves into a situation where they walked into an ambush.
What the tank force doesn't know is that NVA troops are now waiting to ambush them.
The North Vietnamese knew very well that a reaction force, usually built around tanks, would be sent out to help support and protect them. So they would lie in wait for that.
The beleaguered Marines of Bravo 19 have taken heavy casualties when the tanks arrive.
We got to the troops that were still left.
We were taking dead and severely wounded, throwing them on the tank. As Marines, we don't leave the bodies behind. North Vietnamese, they knew what they were doing. Bravo 19 had walked into an ambush, closed around them, and circled them. As soon as we got up near that circle, the North Vietnamese had a bigger circle, which closed around us. And that's when all hell broke loose.
Operation Buffalo represents perhaps an inefficient number of tanks to truly make the difference against a much larger force.
Incoming artillery and mortars started dropping all over us.
We got across a creek and a spotter airplane radioed down to us to turn around that we were in North Vietnam.
Just went in, swung around, and came back.
That's when my tank hit a mine.
But when a mine goes off, you're jerked up and down. You're taking a 52-ton tank, which is a lot of weight, and blowing it up in the air probably 2-3 foot. And it blew off a couple road wheels and the track.
You're sitting there, the radios don't work, and you got a road wheel missing, and track is off, and you're in trouble.
The crew of Tank B-23 now need rescuing themselves.
Gunny Eckler, he's in the other tank, and he's not disabled, but he's going to try to get us out of there.
I'd attach a tow cable, which is probably a 2-inch thick steel cable from tank to tank.
Gunny started dragging us out, and I remember being in that driver's hatch, the heat coming off of that engine, off the other tank was just, I thought I was gonna be cooked alive.
It was a short time later, as we're getting ready to leave, a couple of RPG teams got up close to us.
I remember them yelling and saying there's an RPG team, and I'm in the driver's hatch, and I look out the vision block, and they let loose with a round.
The RPG-2 is the NVA's primary anti-tank weapon. It is a rocket-propelled grenade launcher that fires a 1.8 kilogram shaped charge that can bore through 200 millimeters of armor.
And the first RPG hit our gypsy rack.
We got hit in the gypsy rack. I remember brass was flying all over the place.
While we were being towed out, we started to go up a slight little dike. One of the guys saw an RPG team come out.
When that RPG was aiming at us, the tank was actually being dragged like this and was up in the air. It was going up over that dike. They were aiming for the bottom of the tank.
Just as he fired, we started to come down from that dike. And the RPG bounced off the slope plate.
The RPG usually was not capable of destroying a tank, but it was absolutely deadly to crews. You could get what's called a spalling effect, where fragments of the tank's own armor break loose and ricochet around the interior. And that's what does most of the damage to personnel inside the tank, is bits and pieces of the tank's own armor.
The loader's hatch was open. It was sitting up like this, and it hit the loader's hatch.
And then shrapnel from that hit me in both legs and hit Terry Hunter in the back.
I was literally blown halfway up out of the hatch. And the shrapnel came down inside, and it wounded Brightwell.
I had shrapnel in my leg, my shoulder, my arm.
He looked like a Martian. He had all these pieces of shrapnel sticking out of his helmet. We were smoking and on fire inside.
And it was really funny. We were trying to put out what we thought was a fire with a fire extinguisher. Well, it was an empty fire extinguisher because we had used the CO inside of it to cool down some beer the night before.
And all of a sudden, there's green tracer rounds are coming at us.
Benny Atware just put his foot to the floor. And we made it out. Made it out to the landing zone. Later on, 3 of my crew members, including myself, were medevaced to Cam Ranh Bay Hospital.
During the first day of Operation Buffalo, at least 55 North Vietnamese soldiers are killed. But on that same day, the Americans lose 86 men killed in action, and another 190 wounded, making it their costliest day of the war so far. Despite the losses, U.S. Commander General Westmoreland is determined to increase his forces in South Vietnam.
And was constantly asking for more and more troops to draw them into a climactic conventional battle in which he could destroy the North Vietnamese forces in Vietnam.
January 1968. The North Vietnamese have their own plan to escalate the war. The Communists launch a New Year or Tet offensive, simultaneously attacking over 100 cities, towns, and villages throughout South Vietnam.
Major Tet offensive in early 1968 was that trigger for what they saw as the potential uprising in which they would finally throw out the invaders.
Tet is a major setback for the U.S. war in South Vietnam.
It did provide a political tipping point because it turned American public opinion against the war. The American public and increasingly the political leaders no longer saw it as a winnable war.
After weeks of vicious fighting, the offensive is crushed.
Tet was an absolute disaster for the Viet Cong because these units were exposed to American and South Vietnamese firepower. A lot of them were wiped out. There was no alternative for the communists but to send down increasing numbers of units that had been raised and equipped in the north, regular units of the North Vietnamese Army, equipped with more sophisticated anti-tank weapons, and it was just a fundamental change in the nature of the war to a more conventional war against the North Vietnamese Army.
1968 is turning out to be the bloodiest year of the war. U.S. intelligence pinpoints areas where the enemy is massing its forces. One of these is Go Noi Island, where the NVA has a divisional headquarters.
They would come in and establish secure areas from which they could make forays and attacks against the surrounding areas. And one of those was Go Noi Island, which was the objective of Operation Allen Brook.
Go Noi is 24 kilometers south of Da Nang, surrounded by 2 rivers and bisected by an old railroad bridge. May 4th, 1968. The Americans send a Marine force to eliminate the enemy entrenched on Go Noi, including M48s from the 1st and 5th Tank Battalions. At the head of the armored column is the crew of Tank B-24.
We moved across onto the island, and within hours, the infantry that we were supporting started taking fire and taking heavy fire.
We encountered small arms, machine gun fire, mortar attack.
The communists were taking full advantage of knowing the terrain on which they were fighting and being able to choose where they would fight.
The heavy machine gun fire from the 51 caliber Russian machine guns were shooting a tremendous volume of fire at the helicopters, and we decided it was very unsafe for them to come in, and so we actually had to the first 4 or 5 days without resupply. That meant they were going to run out of food, they were running out of water, and of course we were certainly running out of ammunition.
To get supplies for the main force, the crew of Tank B-24 lead 3 M48s and 2 Amtraks back to their base.
So that morning, on the 6th day, I was forming a column.
We crossed the tree line, didn't encounter anything. And about 400 yards later was another tree line. And you never knew when you approached the tree line, was it safe or not? We did something that's called recon by fire. And the tanks would start using the machine gun and taking that tree line under fire. The enemy doesn't know you don't know they're there. And so they would start firing.
All of a sudden, the RPGs start flying and machine guns start flying.
We were taking a lot of fire. We effectively had been ambushed.
And we started to return fire immediately.
We're firing the cannon, firing a lot of cannon rounds.
Eventually, we ran out of 90mm ammunition. When the NBA saw that the big gun wasn't shooting anymore, then they attempted to get on the tanks.
Which was a specialty of the NVA. They had no qualms at all about climbing on a tank and to jam things like a satchel charge up under the rack at the rear of the turret, to jam the turret, try to get a grenade inside the vehicle, or simply try to kill the crew with small arms fire.
I said, scratch my back, or got the NVA on me, or something like that.
Scratch my back. And in tank terms, that means you turn the machine guns on another tank.
He swung his turret around.
He fired a flechette round, which had little tiny darts in it. But it took the enemy off the tank.
The communist attack on the resupply convoy is taking a toll. the Marines are desperately low on ammunition and in danger of being overrun. A break in the fighting finally allows a helicopter to land.
That afternoon, a helicopter tried to come in to pick up the dead.
As the American chopper approaches, the enemy watches and waits.
We didn't think we had anyone around us, any enemy around us at that point. They just started to get off the ground when all hell opened up. The helicopter took a hit and started auto-gyrate. And at that point you said, my God, we're surrounded.
The Marines are ordered to protect the downed chopper so it can be salvaged and not fall into enemy hands.
So they said, well, stay with the chopper that night. So we set a 360 up.
It was starting to get dark. We knew we were going to get hit that night. There was no question in our minds.
The NVA used a number of techniques that we might consider psychological warfare. The main one was to present the image that they owned the countryside and the night. This meant that any American force out in the countryside could reasonably expect to have a series of probes and attacks throughout the night, deny them rest, and to keep them on edge throughout the time.
We're sitting there watching NVA that was probably 50 yards away from us. A young Marine came over and said, hey, Sarge, there's people in front of your tank with rockets. And I said, well, start shooting them.
And all of a sudden, out in front of us, there was this explosion.
And that RPG, we can see it rotating. It comes right over between the two of us.
And landed behind the tank.
It hit between my feet and knocked me down. 15 or 20 RPGs came over the tank, the side of the tank.
I'm now down inside the tank. And my driver, he was probably 18 or 19. He said, are we going to make it out of here?
But the North Vietnamese again break off their attack, disappearing into the night and thousands of hidden tunnels that crisscross Go Noi Island.
The problem is that the enemy simply just kind of melts away from in front of you and goes underground.
Dawn breaks, and the American tankers wonder when the next assault will begin. As they wait, they suddenly receive new orders.
The morning after the ambush, we were ordered to destroy the helicopter that we had guarded the night before.
U.S. commanders determined that another air rescue is too dangerous. Not wanting to leave anything the NVA can use, the Marines are ordered to destroy the chopper.
I said, blow the helicopter in place and move back towards the Liberty Bridge.
Two weeks into Operation Allen Brook, the U.S. Marines continue to search Go Noi Island for the enemy. And from their fortified bunkers, the NVA continue to find deadly new tactics to harass the Americans.
We moved just off and out into this field. as we did that, the infantry platoon leader called in an artillery strike.
A voice on the radio is calling for American artillery to shell the exact location of the American tanks.
Everybody's looking around in the tank saying, that's not right, that's not right. But it's an American voice, and it clearly was not our guys.
The NVA is using the American infantry's radio frequency to call in an artillery strike.
It was somebody who could speak perfect English, knew our frequencies, knew how to call in artillery.
And in 15 seconds, we've got 105 millimeter cannon shells, artillery shells, dropping right amongst us.
It's landing in our perimeter.
We now are under barrage from our own artillery.
When the Vietnamese communists could set the time and place of battle, they tended to be a step ahead.
Using another radio channel, the American tankers are finally able to stop the artillery barrage.
As I understand, we lost 70 Marines, either killed or seriously wounded, in that attack.
That concept of battle represents what we would call attrition. That is, grinding down your opponent's will to fight by grinding down their forces and inflicting casualties.
This was clearly an indication of us that, man, guys, things have changed. These guys are good. These guys are real good.
The Marines are ordered to pull back to the western end of Gonoy Island. The only route passes under a disused railroad bridge.
And the North Vietnamese would certainly know there was only one way out of there.
There was a tunnel.
The opening is just wide enough for a tank and 3 or 4 feet on each side.
There was no question that that underpass would be mined.
The U.S. military developed a very healthy respect for the creativity, ingenuity, and lengths to which the North Vietnamese Army would go to inflict casualties upon them.
The infantry called in engineers who had mine detectors and what have you, and they probed the entire area under the bridge.
They swept through, got to the other side,
and discovered nothing.
Staff Sergeant Abisi said, no, I don't believe that. Check again.
I had them sweep it 4 or 5 times. I know there's a mine there. Oh, no, it's all clear. So I said, well, I'm not going to go through there. I need my tank for the commands. I took my other section tank. I said, okay, they said it's clear.
First tank starts to go through.
They started through there. As they begin to roll under the trestle, the track begins to roll out from underneath this trestle.
It wasn't a device that was an anti-tank mine that you would expect from the military. This was a homemade thing that was in a wooden box, so it was undetectable, if you will. And that's why the engineers missed it.
They came to be called IEDs in later wars. These had the capability of actually lifting a tank into the air and completely destroying it and killing the crew.
It killed all 3 of the engineers that had swept in front of us.
It's far more common now to counter tanks with IEDs. The idea any insurgent has is to transform their enemy's strengths into weaknesses. They teach their adversary to think of tanks not as a strength, but as a liability. In effect, the insurgent force is trying to teach the conventional force to stop using them.
Operation Allen Brook continues until August 1968. Communist losses are heavy, with close to 1,000 dead. By the time it's over, the Marines suffer more than 1,100 casualties. America's appetite for the war is waning. In 1969, they negotiate with the North for the withdrawal of U.S. forces from South Vietnam. Before the end of the year, the first American tanks are headed home. In the end, the mobile firepower of U.S. tanks proves no match for the unconventional tactics of the communists.
The Vietnam War represents the first great tank versus guerrilla series of battles. What we can learn about tank warfare coming out of Vietnam was the exact lesson the communist insurgents wanted to teach. That tanks represented a weakness in an insurgency as opposed to a strength.
Americans and other foreigners tend to forget that Vietnam has a very long history of resistance to foreign invaders. They were just one more colonial power that was trying to seize control of the country.
By 1972, most American forces have withdrawn from South Vietnam. The U.S. loses over 58,000 killed and 300,000 wounded during the war. April 30th, 1975. North Vietnamese tanks smashed down the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. North and South Vietnam are finally united after fighting that costs millions of lives.